powerful community here. And you guys want to like make change and have an impact in the world. And sometimes like we just don't know exactly how to do that. Like we don't know enough about the issues. We don't feel like we're expert enough to have the conversations. Or like, where do we start? And I guess that's what this series is about. Like we aim to tackle both of those things. So we will come together in groups like this with experts like Chris to learn a little bit more about the social and environmental issues of the day. And ideally, like once we have that information, how we can leverage that to create some kind of change. Because I guess like knowing a thing isn't enough if we don't do anything with it. So how can we inform ourselves? How can we mobilize and do some kind of thing in this world? Because you guys are powerful and brilliant, and we are super excited about what is possible when we come together. So in terms of the series, it's going to look like two key components. So one will be this. Every month we'll have a kind of theme that we are exploring. And there'll be some kind of like community get-together where we'll land together with experts and we'll learn and share knowledge and exchange ideas and kind of like bolster our understanding of what's going on. And the second part, and you'll see this appear on the studio wall in the coming weeks, is a community action board. We're going to come up with ideas of things that we can do as individuals, as a community, as members of this system that we live in to like influence change and translate this theory into some kind of practice. So we are to like track and tally the things that we do as a community. We are to share ideas and exchange resources and just keep that conversation going. So that's going to be a permanent fixture that lives out on the community wall. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But for tonight, for the first session, we're kicking things off and we're looking at racial inequality. Seems like a thing that is getting increasing like awareness in the public sphere. I don't know if you guys clocked in the news recently, but like a week or two ago, First Nation elder Marlene Cummins is like a famous jazz musician. And she was playing on King Street in Newtown, which is like a pretty like big cultural hub in Sydney. And was just performing on the street. And a couple of like young white middle-class dudes came up and started like racially vilifying her. Started like saying things, shouting things, kind of haranguing her for a little while, before eventually moving on. And staff from the bookshop that she was playing in front of came out and apologized, like, oh man, we're so sorry that you had to experience that happens. And her reply was that that's not good enough. Like we're at a point now where it's not enough to be sorry that racism exists. In her words, being anti-racist is an action word. So what does that look like? How do we, with this like increased awareness of social inequality that's kind of existing in this landscape that we operate in, like how do we transform from being well-intentioned to being well-informed? And then further, like how do we use that knowledge to become powerful agents of change? How do we become more effective and supportive allies for First Nation peoples? So to that end, we are just ridiculously fortunate that Chris has come along. Chris is a senior lecturer at Flinders University in both Archaeology and Indigenous Studies. He's the first Indigenous man in Australia to get the PhD in Archaeology. He's done some incredible work around the reclamation of ancestral remains in universities and in that kind of sphere. And he's come along tonight to share his experiences and his knowledge and his journey and his insight so that we can all learn a little bit more and maybe get an understanding of how we can contribute. So, please make him welcome. It's Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks to Power Living and everyone for attending, the talk tonight. And Dan contacted me a few weeks ago. Oh, actually, probably a bit longer ago now. And I guess around the time when the Black Lives Matter movement was kind of emerging, and particularly here in Australia. And I certainly attended, that first rally, and what a great turnout, and example of community coming together to make social change. And it's an example of this is what you're doing tonight, so it's really good to see. So I guess Dan hasn't really given me, he's just said talk openly about your experiences and journey, and the format that we've got here actually is making me feel quite comfortable. So it's an environment in which I can start to share some of my stories. So I will acknowledge as well that I'm on Kaurna land, and that I am of Kaurna descent. I'm also Ngarrindjeri and Latchi. So I grew up here in Adelaide in South Australia, in Noarlunga, down south. So some giggles over there. And I've grown up in the suburbs, so suburbia is that place for me where I kind of grew up and learnt about who I was as an Aboriginal person. And certainly I wasn't able to kind of remove myself from my Aboriginality, because it was instilled in me as a young person by my family, in a good way, in terms of being proud of who I am as an Aboriginal person is something in which we hold quite strong in our community. But it came with it, some challenges and obstacles in growing up, and some of my earliest memories at school were around that idea of racism or racial inequality. So I experienced that quite early in my life, and I guess the kind of mentality or that my family kind of taught me. All the skills was to kind of ignore a lot of other people's behaviour, and particularly around language like abo, bung and coon and things like that, which are the kind of verbal, more overt forms of racism that occur in the schoolyard. But on the football field as well, those things can occur. And I certainly experienced that playing football in juniors. But I guess at the same time, I grew up with quite a lot of non-Indigenous or white friends. We didn't say non-Indigenous, we said our white mates, and that kind of language it was fine for us growing up. And they're still friends with me today, and I had some really important teachers who were non-Indigenous teachers who supported me through my education. I couldn't write an essay until about year 10 or 11. So my art teacher was the one who really I guess saw something in me in terms of passion or motivation to kind of go further in my life. And it was at that point that I started to realise that university was an option for me. So I kind of had it kind of set in my mind that I was going to go to university when I found out about year 8 or 9 that was going to be an option. So I didn't even know it was an option, particularly for being Aboriginal. And so my one of my uncles was working at Flinders University at the time, and he came out to do a visit and recruit Indigenous students, and spoke about the kind of levels of education. And I was stuck on this idea of a PhD. I was like, yeah, I want that doctor and that title in front of my name. And it just kind of resonated with me, because football wasn't going to be my thing, and that's certainly what my family wanted. My dad, I've got 2 other brothers, and my dad was just a mad footballer and good footballer, but never made AFL. So that was his dream. And I didn't want to live through, those kinds of ideas, although I kind of recognise how important football was for, our mob, and there's a platform for, showcasing some of those skills. But I was certainly a teacher's pet at school, and I loved education, and I knew the value of education at a really young age. And so I was interested in dinosaurs and planets, and I knew all the moons on every planet. I don't now, but can't fit everything into my brain these days. But I was just really fascinated with the world and our solar system and kind of the past, and that's where I guess started to self-educate myself around other issues, and kind of steer away from all the race stuff that was going on in my life. Certainly dysfunction was happening too at the same time. So with being Aboriginal and growing up, there's quite a lot of dysfunction that goes with that. And there are dysfunction in our communities in general, but the dysfunction I'm talking to is dysfunction which is, a result of, our historical foundations of our society, the way in which Australia has been founded upon. And I certainly knew that I was experiencing something different to, other people in my peer group at the time. And so I got more interested in learning about my own identity and culture, because I was kind of caught up between, am I Aboriginal or am I not? And, it's kind of a bit of an identity crisis here, as well as, being a teenager. And so life was quite challenging at that point. So I guess I had to move out of home, year 9, and I lived with family members all through my high school years, and I don't know how I did it, but I certainly did not want to be in the situation that I was in terms of the dysfunction. Not just the dysfunction, but the kind of that trauma, you know, the intergenerational trauma that, which I understand now, but I didn't at the time, that my family had experienced, you know, that kind of being caught, you know, in this cycle of not having education. My father certainly didn't have the opportunities I did. So I kind of, you know, I completed year 12 and I got the score I needed to do archaeology, and that was kind of my passion because it enabled me to explore the world, my own backyard, but I wanted to explore Egypt. I found out in my first year that that's not really something in which a lot of Australian archaeologists end up doing. You know, that's kind of Egyptian archaeologists end up doing that. So, and you know, all those ideas about Indiana Jones and all of that. I love Indiana Jones, don't get me wrong, but it's certainly not that type of career. But it certainly drives a lot of people into that area. I guess from my first year at uni, I really learnt that there is so much in our own backyard in terms of the history, the culture, the archaeology that is so significant, and it tells its own story in some way. But you know, as an archaeologist, you can also, you know, you've got some influence and power in putting that narrative together through material remains. So yeah, I was set on archaeology. I was set on doing a PhD, and I was, you know, determined to do those things. And so I went straight from school to uni. In that turn of the millennium, so you know, 2000, I started uni. That's the same year that we had the Sydney Olympics, if you remember, and Cathy Freeman, you know, holding that that iconic image of her. Same year that, you know, the Sydney Harbour walk across the reconciliation walk across Sydney Harbour Bridge. So that was 20 years ago, and so you know, if I kind of reflect back on 20 years of, you know, my experience in higher education from a student to working with Indigenous students, then teaching, yeah, it's been quite a phenomenal experience, really, because I went to Flinders to start a degree, expecting to be out there in the field, and I guess what others had seen in me at the time, so other Indigenous academics, they tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to help, you know, recruit other Indigenous students. They wanted someone young, someone who you know, knew the community and could help encourage more Indigenous students into the university. So I did that for about 12 years in Ngarrindjeri First Nations Centre, which is now Office of Indigenous Strategy and Engagement, mouthful, because universities like to do these things and change their names, like government departments. But the kind of focus of, you know, the strategy of, you know, that particular place I was working at was around growing Indigenous students and growing Indigenous employment. And you know, after 20 years, we're at a point now that the university's now got a reconciliation action plan, and we're kind of working through, you know, Indigenous workforce strategy. And so I've been helping with some of that, you know, in terms of its governance and policy stuff. So quite a privilege, really, to kind of help the university move its direction to, you know, be more aware and inclusive, and, you know, start to be more diverse in its employment too. So, so I'm going to stop there in terms of my little journey, because I've got some photos that I want to show, because they're probably more interesting than looking at me and my reading. And just before I guess we move on to that, I just want to thank everyone for your patience, because I was a little bit late, and I did get a haircut, but that's not why I was late. And I thought I had time. So I guess what I've prepared today is kind of a combination of my work in Indigenous archaeology, some of my story, and I guess just I'll touch on just some of how this relates to race or inequality or diversity. So is that okay if we put some of those slides up? And yeah. So we can start from the beginning. From the beginning of time. No. Cool. So I kind of just called it Indigenous Archaeology in Australia's Shared Future. Often the media and you know, our society, they portray Indigenous or race issues from a real negative point of view or a deficit point of view. So I guess the way in which we teach education, or, you know, any issues to do with, you know, Indigenous people, First Nation people, it's always from a reconciliation framework or reconciliation pedagogy way of teaching. And you know, it's always, you know, we know about this kind of idea of our past our kind of, there's this white blindfold view and this black armband view. And I think we often do get fixed too much in the past. And so there's an orientation now towards this shared idea, this shared space, this shared future. Kind of moving the thinking in our society to one that, we can actually make change as agents, like Dan was saying, in our own ways. And we can do that, starting with ourselves as individuals. And that's the really important point here. And that's kind of how we like to teach. It's from the ground up, not the top-down approach. So that's just that first image. So I work in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. I teach archaeology as well as reconciliation, Indigenous knowledges, and introduction to Indigenous studies. And I've been teaching Indigenous studies for about 15 years. So I love teaching first years. It's my passion, that topic. And they're just it's always great to have first years come in because you help kind of shape and mould that kind of their direction in their university education. So that's always useful. By third year, you're kind of set in your ways. Some of you probably have already gone to university, I'm sure. But so next slide. That image of me is at a place called Pembroke. It was one of the places I excavated for my PhD. And Pembroke is located at Murray Bridge. So it's used to be like a boat ramp overlooking the River Murray, just under the bridge. And so that was one of the places that elders wanted me to focus on because it was one of the last sites that Ngarrindjeri people camped in the fringe camps during that time when Aboriginal people were kind of segregated out of society. So Albert Carlone was one of the last initiated men, Ngarrindjeri men, who was camping there at the time. And we didn't find any kind of evidence for, that period of time because most of that's kind of taken. It's been, destroyed from other activity. But certainly, we found some other history there. So I've kind of acknowledged country already. This is a photo taken Australia Day smoking ceremony down in Elder Park, and the Premier at the time had photographs with Uncle Moggy Sumner and others. And I guess what I'm highlighting here is we look at land as being quite a holistic philosophy of connection to country, but connection to each other, and connection to spirituality. So it's a spiritual-based type of philosophy, in Indigenous culture, and certainly I've grown up with some of that. But of course, my process of going through education has helped to bring together some of the other history I didn't know and some of the other information which is in books, and I can talk to that in a minute. But so we refer to it as Ruri or Ruar. It's a Ngarrindjeri term, and that means land, body, and spirit. So I guess I'm just demonstrating there that country isn't about the physical landscape; it's about body. It's about our kind of physical bodies, how we relate to the land, how we relate to each other, and our engagement in in other ways of knowing. And so other ways of knowing are through creation stories, and a lot of creation stories have been documented from that point of contact. And certainly, in South Australia, there's quite a lot of ethnography and anthropology that was done, recording stories. Recording that knowledge, recording the language, and we're fortunate enough to have a huge repository of that information in the South Australian Museum and other archives here. And I'll talk more about the state and how important the state is too in a minute. So next. Black Lives Matter. So what is the issue raised for awareness in our society? I mean, it's a global issue. It's one that hasn't necessarily just recently popped up, maybe in some of our awareness and consciousness, but certainly it's helped to reignite some of those debates and issues around race, politics, but also the way in which Indigenous people, but minorities, are marginalised and continually being dispossessed through our legal system. So the case in the US is one of which at the hands of the police, which is an extension to the legal systems in what we call settler state or settler colonial states. So those particular nations, the US, New Zealand, Australia, which was settled on a framework of colonialism, and some of those foundations weren't, done through any kind of, I guess, legal transaction, or were done in, I guess. they were done in ways in which were quite violent and didn't actually uphold legal frameworks of that time. So I guess what has reignited is this I guess it brings back into our memories and our consciousness that our legal system is actually still quite powerful in the way in which it continues to dispossess and disadvantage Indigenous people and minorities in particular. And the stop black deaths in custody is an issue which for the last 20 years has been highlighted by different groups, Indigenous activists and so forth, around the way in which Indigenous people have continued to die in custody. And no matter what the reason of death may have been, the issue has been that regardless of reports that have been commissioned about Aboriginal people dying at the hands of the police and our legal system, there's been no change, and in fact it's actually gotten worse. So I think at the moment we have about 430 to 440 Aboriginal deaths in custody since the report was released into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and that was quite some time ago now. So it just helps to reignite some of those debates in the past and just remind us that we actually haven't achieved the things in which reports have set out to achieve in the past. Part of that is can be a legal problem. There's also political problems, and there can be generational and societal problems as well. Don't worry about the stuff on the left, but I guess the way in which I talk to this idea of Aboriginality is very much a Western construct of who we are as Aboriginal people. So that's why I'll introduce as being Ngarrindjeri, and we always kind of acknowledge that because that's who we are. And certainly I was Ngarrindjeri before I was Aboriginal. And so what our society tends to do, or our governments tend to do, is box people into these racial categories. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are the only racial group that is categorised, in a legal definition, in policy, and is asked to actually tick boxes. And sometimes I go, nah, I'm not ticking that box. So I'm not ticking that box today. But I also understand how important it is for numbers to be, or data to be gathered, for governments, for funding bodies and all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, an example of having agency or some control over your life is by not ticking that box. So I'm proud to be Aboriginal, but I'm also proud to be Australian, and I think that's the key point I want to convey, is that there are solutions to move forward, and the solutions come from us as individuals and the collective, and that starts at the community level. So these huge protests that you see are just magical in the way that they can raise awareness and consciousness, and the media grabs onto them. And certainly, I'm just feeling the energy from being there, and you've got my white friends, my black brothers and sisters, and there's people of all ethnicities there, and of all sexualities and of all ages. So I think that's power when we all come together in a community. So yeah. So I guess there are, in terms of racism and our racial equalities in our society, this is not new for what's happened in the US or what continues to happen here. This is something which has been a historical thing in our society in Australia. And so I'm just showing you some images. I don't know if you know of any of them. Does anybody know any of those people? Yeah, which one do you recognise? Adam Goodes. Yeah. Sport's so important for Australians, isn't it? Yeah. Does anybody know who's next to Adam Goodes on the left? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and certainly that image, when I was younger, we just loved doing that. So we would pull our shirts up too and go, But I'd be like, oh, hang on, I need a tan, actually. So, not that black, but, it's okay, because I'm still Aboriginal, right? There's a few other people in that slide. They're quite important. Obviously, Kathy Freeman, I've mentioned one already. Ivan Gulagon, yeah. Who said that? Yeah. Oh, okay, there you go. And this is the thing, we will know certain people based on, our own life's experiences and what we know as well. and what we've experienced. So, yeah, even Goolagong, you know, one of the first, I think, woman to, you know, win a Grand Slam, and, you know, we have Ash Barty now to kind of follow that legacy of, you know, women, but also Indigenous women or Indigenous people. So, you know, we're not just representing, you know, being black or Indigenous in this arena, or in whether it's sport or education or politics. We also represent our nation too, and our nation's story, and now we carry with it the legacy of our past, but we also can have influence in other ways. And I think, you know, sport's just a great example of how we all can, you know, connect and relate across different domains, but also music. And that's why I've put up there, you know, Yothu being, you know, the first, you know, Aboriginal group to record in Aboriginal language. And that was in the 80s, the time when we had Midnight Oil, and all those other bands, you know, Guyana, and there's, you know, Warumpi Band. So, you know, those Australian rock bands were really important for raising awareness and consciousness around, you know, racial inequalities. But it was about social justice, and, you know, Midnight Oil's, you know, a fantastic example. Peter Garrett, you know, moving into politics and really following through with his passion, you know, for social justice, really. I mean, you know, he was educated at ANU, and that was then when he did an Indigenous Studies course, I think, or the issue, you know, about what happened here, our foundations of our history, you know, I guess struck him at that time, and around the time that they formed their band. And so that's why a lot of his songs are, you know, lean towards that social justice and particularly Indigenous rights. And yeah, what a kind of you know, good person to have alongside in the 80s, you know, to raise awareness. Also boxers, and Neville Bonner too, you know, people in politician. We had Sir Douglas Nicholls here in the state, who was the first governor of any state or territory, and I think continues to be the only one. But yeah, next slide. Or maybe not. Can't talk to that one. But yeah. You guys might be able to. Yeah. So I guess now I'm moving into part of my story, and I've told you some of that at the beginning, but I want to just... The image on the right here is a photograph which is taken out of Norman Tindale's collection of photographs. Does anybody know who Norman Tindale is? Come across him? No? Okay. So, Norman Tindale? Do you know? So Norman Tindale was an anthropologist who worked out of the South Australian Museum here in the 20s, 30s, 40s. I can't sure when he passed away, but he didn't just record. He went throughout Australia and documented Indigenous languages, took photographs of children, got them to do drawings, you know, and his descriptions in these journals about his expeditions kind of form the basis of a lot of the work that we go back to now and look at in terms of the genealogies and family histories, you know, information about cultural practices, and, you know, I guess information about people's lives, particularly in the 30s and 40s, which was a time when a lot of Aboriginal people were on missions and reserves. So I told you the story about Albert Carlone. You know, he was on the fringe camps outside of Murray Bridge. But then we also have missions and reserves. I don't know if you know of that, but they still exist. So that was a period in which, you know, governments enacted policy to, you know, put half-caste, you know, people onto missions and reserves, thinking that they were going to die out. Thinking that, you know, by doing that there could be some education as well, and those who were deemed to be fit for society, you know, Western society, that they could then be transitioned or assimilated into society. So the idea of assimilation is coming in at this time, and you know, that's based on these racial ideologies, you know, which we no longer are kind of, they're not founded in any type of evidence. They're based, you know, in ideas about race, that you know, by breeding out people, you know, you can, you know, have people contribute to society in an intelligent way or in a productive way. So with all of that, you know, has we're left with all these legacies from our history, and some of that is mission sites and reserves, and so there's a lot of dysfunction which occurs in communities because they're still in missions and reserves. And although some of that control's been handed to community groups or community councils, they're not funded in any particular way. The kind of resources that they get are very minimal. Certainly you don't have access to quality healthcare and things like that. And then the further kind of central North Australia you go, the even further distant access to resources and education and health gets, and so that's been some of the problems that we continue to face. So that was my grandfather in that photograph, and his brother. And so my grandfather's the one on the left. So his name was Alan Wilson, and that's Emmanuel on the right. And you can see the kind of mug shots which are taken. So that mugshot photograph is very much one in which is a colonial. It's a colonial representation of the Aborigine, really. I mean, or of the native. And it's also, I guess, representing power and control, and that kind of extension of the colonial institutions, the way that they have treated Indigenous people. So I guess this was a practice in anthropology. It was kind of taking photographs and jotting down, their family lines. But, I mean, we're fortunate enough to have all those documents now, so we can go back and look at them. There's a point. So next slide. Am I talking too much? Is this interesting? So this is now showing you a crown drawing, which I came across when I was doing my archival research for my PhD. So I guess one of the things to raise is that there is an issue here about access. So these records are held within institutions like museums, like the South Australian Museum. And to access them, you either need to be Aboriginal, and now they changed the policy so you can go in and access, or you need to be a researcher. So there have been court cases in the past, around stolen generations and other issues around destruction of sites or development in the state, in which the state has really locked away a lot of the evidence and access to things. So we can access things like journals, but certainly some of those more, some of those documents about children who were taken from their families are certainly locked away in other legal offices. So the kind of access to get that by anyone is kind of closed, really, and only available to the government. Yeah. So there's some records we can access and others we can't to write our stories or tell our stories. Yep. Next one. So Dan mentioned that I've done some work with repatriation and bringing back human remains, both from museums here in Australia, what they call domestic, and then international museums as well. So I guess I started doing this about 2004 as part of some research I did for my honours, and it was by elders at the time who've now passed asked me to do this work and to go across to the UK and help bring back some of these remains, and gave me the task of organising the reburials for this. So at the time, it was about 14 years ago. Oh my God! So that's maybe mid-20s at that time, and so quite a big responsibility for me, but one in which I took with quite pride, a lot of pride, and I knew how important it was to do. So that was my first experience with doing research and really working with government and industry and museums and universities externally, other than my own, to look at issues which continue to impact Indigenous people. And this certainly is an example of how that colonial story of our nation continues to impact people. I mean, we're still handing back remains that were taken during this period of collecting and obsession about the native and collecting bodies, and it's kind of we're in that process now of returning those, so that's still occurring. I mean, this is 200 and something years later, and it's quite emotional for people because this practice occurred right at the point of contact up until the 1960s. So there are documents which have people's names allocated against some of those remains, and so that some of the families are still alive and remember these people. And so it's actually quite a confronting thing for families. I guess I stopped doing that when I started to help, organise some of those into their little boxes that you saw for reburial. And when I found out what was in some of those boxes, it kind of turned me away from wanting to do any more work with human remains, because it's not just skeletal remains, there's also other parts of the human body preserved in jars, and all parts of the body. And so when I kind of saw what was listed in one of the boxes and it was open, I freaked, and I decided not to well, I didn't handle them anyway, but not to be in the room with them, because just really confronting for me. So it took me about a year or two to really kind of shift, get over that, emotionally and spiritually, culturally, and really kind of shift the focus, because I was going to extend that to do my PhD, and I decided to not to do that. I just thought it wasn't something that would help with my career, if you know what I mean. It would probably send me the other way. So I'll show you a couple more slides, and then I guess we can turn these histories around in ways in which we learn from them. So Damien Shen's a Ngarrindjeri artist, but he's also Chinese. So there's this history, other interesting history with Ngarrindjeri people. There's Afghan families, Chinese families, Irish families, and that's kind of the interactions with Europeans. And what I learnt in doing some of my research about my genealogies is that I'm from a whaling family. So it was a French whaler, Wilson, that's all that was documented, took Fanny, a full-blood Aboriginal woman, over to Kangaroo Island during that whaling industry, and that was before this colony was set up. So that was in about the 1820s, and so that's as far back as we can go tracking my family, and that really made me realise that we need to think, for the Aboriginal community, we need to actually think, and know more about who we are in our families, because there's this story of whaling, but there's Chinese ancestry, and other, I guess, ways in which we've contributed. So we're not just Aboriginal, we're not just from this history of colonial dispossession. We're actually being part also of the industries which have set up this state or this nation. And so for me that was like, well, hang on a second, no longer do I think of myself as being the victim, or a victim of colonialism or whatever, but I'm also being part of this overall story. Like it's not a victim mentality I should be thinking about. So it really helped me kind of change my attitude about myself, I guess, by doing some of this research. So next slide. This is showing you one of my little holes there, because we like to show off what we do. And so I guess the kind of work that I've done is very young there, wasn't I? Yeah. 2007, 8 that was. So I guess my work's been in the archaeology of the Lower Murray. So I've been looking at shell bins and looking at sites along freshwater riverine environments and the way that people lived, before, or even up until today. So the sites that I worked on were dated using what we call radiocarbon dating, and some of those sites are 8,500 years old, which is quite important for the area that we excavated. When I say we, there's a team of us, of course, and yeah, quite significant. I mean, it wasn't. It was already known that people were in this area around 10,000 years ago. The river formed at about 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, so that mid, kind of what we call Holocene. Sorry, throwing all these words up. Sorry, it's not a lecture, is it? But, so I guess, yeah, the interesting find from that was fish ear bones, or what we call otoliths, and they're Murray cod ones. So they actually, as the fish is spawned or born and it grows with it, like rings of its life history, like a tree does. And so one of the things that we did was we dated and analysed those ear bones, and came back with some interesting information, like they were spawned in salt water and they then moved into fresh water through their early life, and then some of them were 35 years in age at their time of death, and others were 2.2 metres in length at their time of death. And so this kind of information was quite significant to, you know, I guess, and new information about, you know, what's going on in the River Murray. Obviously, that takes a lot of organisation and skill in terms of how you catch a Murray cod. So that's when we go back to the record, what's in the museum, and, you know, or we go and talk to elders about that stuff. So, next slide. You know, so I told you the story about whaling, and so, you know, that whaling history was quite fascinating. And so this is Adam Patterson on the right. He works at the South Australian Maritime Museum, and he approached me and said, look, we're doing an exhibition around Leviathan, giant whales, and we really want to incorporate some of that story about, you know, your great-grandfather, Sister Wilson. So the next slide, I think it's in there. Maybe I didn't put it up there. So the story of Sister Wilson was he gave an account of, he was 102, and he gave an account in 1929 of his life catching kangaroo and of experiences of being a whaler. And he spoke about, you know, being dragged out to sea, you know, a certain number of miles, and it took them 2 days to row back, to swim back, actually, not row back. And he was 102 when he gave the account to the local newspaper, and it was quite fascinating for me because, I mean, 102 is just fascinating itself. But to actually have a recollection like that kind of meant that, you know, there's quite good memory and, you know, cognitive ability for, you know, our mob back then. It wasn't that long ago. So, you know, that kind of lifespan of Indigenous people has declined only in a recent time period. So it's only happened, you know, around the 30s and 40s, you know, when quite extreme policy started to come in up until now. So we're only talking, you know, 60 years, just over a generation or so. So that decline in health and all of that is a recent thing. So it was kind of highlighting that thing. It's showing you the ear bone. Very hard to see when you're excavating, but I guess the important thing here is George Main from the National Museum contacted me once we put a paper out and said, look, I'm fascinated by this 2.2 metre, you know, Murray cod, and can we put it in our new exhibition? So the National Museum is changing its the way in which it tells the story of Australia now, and its position in Australia. So it's telling the story in 3 parts. One's around environmental histories, you know, one's the Gallery of the First Australians, and then the other one is Australia after 1788. And so I guess the point is that these institutions are, you know, have a huge role to play in the way in which our public's educated, and so being able to help influence the stories or the narratives in those places are really significant parts of what we do. So, you know, working with not just local community, but we work also with those other institutions as well. So whether it's research or helping with exhibitions. So yeah, it's just a privilege to get some of that work into the museum at such an, you know, early stage of, you know, finishing the work. So I finished my PhD in 2017. So yeah, it's still all kind of coming out in terms of, you know, some of that work. Next slide. Am I talking too much, everyone? Do you want me to start? So, okay, I guess I'm just now showing what well, it's drawing on this idea of Indigipop. So it's the popular culture of Indigenous people. So, and I'm just going to flick through these because I guess what I'm saying here is that, you know, the popular culture is the key kind of way in which we are all influenced. And so Indigenous people have been part of popular culture since colonisation, whether that's, you know, well, they've been part of our history and our nation's story since colonisation. And so popular culture has helped to showcase a lot of, you know, the contributions that Indigenous people have made to society. So, and these histories are part of our national identity. So if we just go next one. Does anybody know who they are? Yeah. Yep. Yeah? See, we heard the song about Australia Day and all of that, yeah? Yeah, so that's Trials on the left. So Daniel Rankin, who I grew up with down south, yep. And so, you know, I've got to plug, you know, my cousins and my brother boys here. So, but really proud also of the way in which, you know, their careers, you know, still, you know, they're still following through with, you know, their passion for change and social justice, and they do it in a different way, raising consciousness. So, you know, we don't have to always talk about race and racism, although that's, you know, the foundation of the inequality sometimes, but we can convey those in different ways. So next slide.
Just that if you guys weren't across it, those guys have a documentary coming out next week.
Okay.
It's part of the Melbourne International Film Festival called Looky Looky, Here Comes Cookie, about like Captain Cook's arrival from a First Nation perspective. This guy's like produced it, and like it looks like it's gonna be real good.
And so humour is a really important part, you know, of being Aboriginal or being Australian, right? So but being able to put humour into any aspect of work that we do certainly occurs. Like there's no space that I haven't been in where, you know, there's been a joke, or we joke about ourselves, or we joke about each other, and yeah. So next slide. This is showing you Christine Anu, my island home. We can go to the next one because I've already spoken about her. She doesn't get another plug. Jessica Mowboy, like, who remembers Jessica Mowboy on Australian Idol? Yep, it's coming out of the bush, you know. With that voice is just pretty phenomenal. Although Jessica Mowboy, you know, her music is pop music, you know, it's kind of, her lyrics are also, you know, not lent in that space of social justice, or she doesn't, you know, necessarily draw on that inspiration. Although she talks about, she draws on other parts of her culture for inspiration. It might not form the lyrics, but it certainly forms the way that she is as an artist. I think is an important thing to say. So she still represents, you know, Indigenous Australia or Australia in what she does in the same way. So next. I've already showed them. Next. Sia's from Adelaide, we all knew that, yeah? But one of her Clap Your Hands film clip, I don't know if you've seen it, but one of the first images that she uses in there is of the Aboriginal flag. It's upside down, though. But, you know, from what I know, from what I've heard, is that, you know, her kind of background is very much in that space of being, you know, of social justice as well. But she's had her own experiences in life as well, which, you know, have formed her career. But I guess it was not only do we use lyrics but you know, we use other iconography as well, other representations. Yeah. Coldplay, you know, part of their film clip is in Sydney. You know, I Have a Dream. Yeah. So you know, making the statement there, you know, just in the way in which that film, you know, that film clip was filmed, you know, it's quite significant. So I Have a Dream, you know, bringing in other aspects of history around race relations as well. So next. And then, of course, you know, when we've got people like Ed Sheeran, who, you know, my daughters love, but I love too. And so, yeah, just, I mean, when he wore that Aboriginal T-shirt, it just made me so proud. Like, I don't even know Ed Sheeran, I think I do, but, you know, like, it's just such a proud moment, you know, as an Aboriginal Australian, Aboriginal person, to be like, wow, you know, you've got international artists who actually want to make statements like this, which I think is just, you know, phenomenal. It just goes to show that, you know, there are ways to make change, and people are doing that. And obviously it's still in the consciousness, and, you know, really significant issues for people who aren't Australian too. So, and certainly the experience of going to, you know, the UK, the attitudes in the UK in terms of Indigenous people and returning remains was overwhelmingly positive. Like, they actually don't have the same kind of, you know, I guess this kind of guilt and shame which has gone with some of our history. They don't have that burden with them. So some of the interviews that we did with some of the collections managers of the museums were crying because they just didn't want these remains anymore. It was actually emotional for them, and you certainly don't get that as much in Australia. But yeah, institutions, you know, have had, you know, their own experiences with Indigenous, you know, people and relations outside of this country. So, next one. I don't know if you've heard this song, but I use this in my teaching to show an example of reconciliation and, you know, some of the magic that occurs with, you know, with the popular culture, with music. You know, that's Gurumu there, who's also part of Yotha Yundi, who's now passed away. and Delta Gudrum. This is the second season of The Voice, and singing Bayini. So to this composition, this duet, you know, it was the first of its kind, and so the way in which it was sung was the first of its kind, and Delta's singing also in language as well. So it just goes to show that cross-cultural, I guess, sharing of knowledge, you know, for something like that is just absolutely, yeah, I think beautiful. So next, I've spoken about this. Next. I don't know how much more I've got here. Do you want me to kind of stop here and we can just talk? Because, I mean, there's a timeline of events which are really significant for this state, which I wasn't too sure if I would get to it or not. But you can see just in the slide there that and the person on the slide here is Bungari, his name is, and he's from New South Wales coast. But he was the first Indigenous Australian to circumnavigate Australia, and he did that with Matthew Flinders in 1802. And that's quite a significant part of our history. I mean, Flinders and Baudin, they met and kind of finished their mapping of Australia at Encounter Bay. So, you know, there's quite an important navigation story there in our history. He's also the first Indigenous person to be granted land by colonial authorities. There were Indigenous people in the state who were able to vote, so people don't know that. So there were voting rights here for Indigenous people. And a lot of the first international cricket team was Indigenous and made up of, you know, Ngarrindjeri people and other Indigenous people here from the state. Lola Cho Donoghue was the first Indigenous nurse. She's from here, part of the Stolen Generations member. And as I mentioned, Sir Douglas Nichols, sorry, you know, being the first governor to hold, you know, kind of that kind of office, rights, regal office, is quite significant as well, and that was here in this state. So, yeah, and I guess, you know, I won't go too much more into the timelines, but there's, you know, the first Indigenous PhD wasn't until 1980, and that was in education, I think. So, I mean, you know, in terms of Indigenous people in higher education, we're talking 40 years as well. And, you know, archaeology in Australia has been around since the 1960s, and it started at ANU. So archaeology has been around for 40, 50, 60 years, and so it's taken that long for them to, or for the discipline to have, you know, I guess a PhD completed who's Indigenous. And I get shame when I hear people say, you know, first Indigenous person. But at the same time, another colleague of mine, Kelly Pollard, she finished her PhD about a year later. So first Indigenous woman, and she's up in CDU teaching Aboriginal studies. So I'm going to stop there because I'm blah talking. But I guess I'm just, yeah, hopefully that gives you a cross-section of sharing about some of my story, you know, some issues to do with race, but injustice, but the way in which we flip that and can actually, you know, make change, positive change, and educate ourselves and each other about it. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Beautiful.
If you want to open it up and yarn, I'm happy to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you kindly, first of all. You're amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Beautiful, guys. This is just a space for you to ask any questions that you have kind of simmering in your head or heart spaces. This is a safe place. Throw it out there. This is how we learn.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I want to understand, how do I understand the proper way to acknowledge country in the place that I live, which is in the Adelaide Hills. So would it be wise for me to seek out somebody to talk to about the Paramount people, or can that be something that, is it something that I just don't really know how to say with some sort of authority, like I acknowledge this. I don't want to say it as just something that I've read or...
Yeah. So I think if, you know, local community groups or Aboriginal communities like the Ghana Heritage Committee or state governments, they have different kind of guidelines or appropriate ways of acknowledging country. So you can get that from places like Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement on their website, I think. And different institutions have different acknowledgements as well. So like Flinders University has an acknowledgement about all the campuses that it has. But yeah, I think, it's, it's kind of, there are some places that are accepted as being, Ghana and Ngarrindjeri, and then there are some that overlap. And, but certainly, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but, I think an acknowledgement's an acknowledgement, so you don't need a permission to do that. And it's just a sign of, respect. To clarify that, you can ask either local community group, local councils maybe know, or you jump online and there's, links or emails for Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, South Australian Native Title Service, different organisations who can help clarify information or wording and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's the word was the permission. Like, do I need to get permission to acknowledge it in a respectful way?
Yeah.
But I'll seek out.
Yeah, I think if it's published, then you need permission. But if it's in,
For our events that we're talking
yeah.
And if it's welcome to country compared to acknowledgement of country.
Yeah. Yeah, so Welcome to Countries have, so the Ghana Heritage Committee, I don't know if that's their correct name, I should know, but they have a list of elders and community members who can do Welcome to Countries. Yep.
Put a question from the chat. So we're so tech savvy here.
It looks very tech savvy.
So multimedia. Chris, your positive energy is contagious. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
We'll take that as a comment. What positive events or movements happening soon can we get involved with, or ways to further educate ourselves?
Okay. Well, that's always up and down. Those, what we can get involved in this environment. I think, Reconciliation Australia. Reconciliation Week and NAIDOC Week are the two big kind of events for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And then, of course, other places have, festivals and things like that too, where you can, a lot of people go up to the Barunga Festival up in Northern Territory and, or there's the Ngarrindjeri Festival down the Murray River that Uncle Moogie has. So at the moment, I don't know if there's much events. A lot of them are online. So, yeah. But certainly... NAIDOC Week, there's events coming up October or November now. So I think, go to the NAIDOC website and that's the most recent national events that are coming up. And they'll give you breakdowns of states that are doing different events, and organisations and local community groups can also sign up and join into events if they want to run events as well.
Yeah. John?
At the risk of making you a spokesperson for all Aboriginals, I think I was going to ask, what do you see as the most pivotal shortcomings that's preventing us from incorporating Indigenous culture into the broader Australian identity?
That's a big question, isn't it? Yeah.
Where I see us at the moment as a nation, I guess I'll kind of compare it to New Zealand. Most New Zealanders understand their identity as New Zealanders in the context of being Māori, whether they're Māori or not. Whereas here there tends to be a schism of being Indigenous or being Australian, and there's two kind of very separate things. And for me, the way I see the future for us is sort of a celebration of understanding our Australianness, whether we're Indigenous or not, in the context of that. And I think that because we live in a time where we have all this knowledge, we understand all these really important historical Indigenous figures and culture and all of that stuff. We have all of this history to draw on to tell us who we are as a nation, and we don't really understand who we are as Australians.
Yeah, and that's part of the debate and the issues, with, I guess there needs to be political change, for things to move, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only thing that needs to occur. I mean, all these other social movements are quite significant too, but I guess it's also a generational thing as well. So there's politics, there's our legal system, and then there's generational thing too, I think. But the differences between Australia and the rest of those nations are the foundations in which they were founded, or the foundations of those particular states or nations. So Australia's the only one that doesn't have a treaty, and some of you probably know that. Other countries do, so there's already a relationship, some kind of agreement which was made, at that time in some kind of legal form that, helped move forward other things for the, First Nations peoples. So the US, they have reservations and they have complete control over their reservations as part of their treaty processes. And, we've all heard about the casinos on there, and, I haven't been to them, but I've got colleagues who've been to them, and they're massive, the biggest casinos. Yeah, like me. Yeah, anyway, I don't need to worry about casinos. And, with New Zealand too. Yeah, in New Zealand with the language, it's there's a collective there, for Māori, and there's a kind of collective identity too for Māori, which they can all affiliate with, whereas in Australia it's quite different, and colonialism happened in different places at different times, and there's so much diversity in this continent. It just shows how big and vast this nation really is. So yeah, that's the question that's always been kind of, I guess, raised. How do you, and that's part of people talking about shared spaces and shared futures, and how do you kind of move together with shared histories. There's no kind of easy answer to that, really. Yep.
I don't really know much about archaeology, but I guess just having a PhD in archaeology, we found the discipline is very much, is there anything that you feel that that could change with the teaching because of, like with, what did he call it? Rural land?
Yeah.
Rui?
Rui? Yeah. Or Rua? Yeah.
So it's not just the land, but it's obviously about spirit and whatnot. And so as an archaeologist, you're studying the land. And I've heard of like songlines. So that tells you a lot about like, the history of different places. And how that you've been able to incorporate that into archaeology studies, not just about the land.
Yeah, so one of the ways in which they get incorporated is from people's lived experiences, being Indigenous or Indigenous ways of knowing. So, one of my colleagues did her PhD on songlines. Her family are from the Anangu, from APY lands, and her mum was a song composer. And so with composing songs comes with all that knowledge and all the stories and songlines and places which are really significant as part of those songlines, and their trade routes and all of this kind of stuff. So there's musicologists and different, people who've done these recordings. But yeah, so the way we approach it through, our, I guess what we call our ontology or way of being. Sorry with all these words, but it's about changing the way in which the discipline approaches its work with Indigenous people. So rather than working on Indigenous country, they're working with Indigenous communities, for Indigenous communities, and some of the research is done by Indigenous communities. So I guess that's probably the easiest way to put it, is that it's no longer, do these professions come in and do their research and take their notes, but instead they engage in that process of consultation, going to the right people. You're talking about consulting in some way by getting permissions, which is the good step. One of the first steps is about asking permission, because that's really starting to acknowledge, that people have rights, that there are people here, that people do have a voice and a place to speak. And so, so I guess that's probably the best way to put it, is it's in the kind of approaches and the practices that we now do into our research, I guess, in our work. And so then we work collectively to put in that knowledge. So it's, so it becomes more, the narrative, becomes more rich. Like I just heard a colleague talk today about buffaloes in Northern Territory and rock art. And, a lot of the story about those buffaloes on the rock art, she wouldn't know if she wasn't talking to Indigenous people. So, and the same with a lot of the musicologists who recorded stuff, they have to translate that language and then the concepts. And so there's a lot of engagement that goes with it. So, Yeah, it's about working with people. Yeah. Always long answers.
Big questions. Something you mentioned earlier, the difference that you noticed between like UK academics and Australian academics was like kind of presence or absence of that shame and guilt. Someone's just flicked through on the Insta. How much do you think that like white guilt is holding us back from moving forward?
Yeah. Well, I think... Oh. That's a sign.
I'm shocked too. Yeah.
Well, this is part of that whole story about, you know, the white blindfold view and black armband view of history and the whitewashing and, you know, the ways that historians have portrayed our nation's history, because it is a historian's responsibility in some way to tell the story. I mean, that's part of their role. And but archaeologists are now kind of stepping in with a different story to also tell, and we all do it in fields, but I think it's definitely one of the, you know, key things which I think hold the nation back. And I was mentioning before about the generational change is needed. It is very much not, you know, and it's not necessarily that generation. So it's not pinpointing like the baby boomers or you know any particular generation as such, but the ideologies that have flowed through those generations. So, you know. Yeah, so I don't want to box or categorise it as such, but you know, some of those ideologies continue to exist in our society through, in those ways. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If I wanted to learn more about Ghana language or do some kind of course, where would be the best place to go?
Who's teaching the Ghana stuff? I should know this, shouldn't I? Was it? I can't remember if it's TAFE or not. So different community organisations are teaching the language. But I don't know through its training organisation is. I think it's TAFE. Yeah, I'm not too sure because UNISA used to do it. So I think it's TAFE who does Indigenous languages. So there's three. I think there's Ngarrindjeri, Pitjantjatjara, and Ghana. Yeah. So there's three languages that have a course that people can do now. Yeah. In this state. Yeah. And I think they're starting to put that into, education, primary and secondary.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Beautiful. We've got a couple of questions on the text line, but I'm also mindful of time boundaries and don't want to keep people too long. Does anyone have anything kind of simmering that they would like to share, question, ask?
I don't know if this is like too big a question, but how do we enact like this generational change? Like, is it education in schools, or how do we begin to make those changes?
Yeah. Well, you're doing it now. You do it when you inform yourself of certain issues. And then taking other actions, so going to events, making connections and relationships with different organisations and different Indigenous groups, doing a course, or when you're at university, or you're kind of privileging, or being mindful or aware of how important it is to do some of that. Education or self-education or learning around that issue. So, I think it's, that's what I would say,
Question off the back of that. I suppose people that are maybe less white and privileged to go to university, how do those people kind of access more information and education about these things? This event is so fantastic because it's free and we all kind of have this privilege that we pay money and go to yoga and we're probably all educated, but then there's people that maybe don't have that kind of access as easily. Yep. And I feel like it's so important for them as well.
Yeah, so NITV. So there are local newspapers and local radio stations. So here we've got Radio Adelaide, Nungawonga. I think it's Monday night. NITV always, their programs are, are always community orientated, community run, and really accurate with the information as well. So they're always checked, that information. Just online, there's plenty of resources, through the ABC website. There's the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies as well. So they're the national repository for all information, including sound, archive, film, and publications about Indigenous people. So you can, most of it's freely accessible. Actually, I don't know. Yeah, but you should be able to go on there and find information about that too, and keep, just looking at local Indigenous groups and organisations in the state as well, and NAIDOC events and reconciliation events. And schools are great. They're great with how they bring in local community members. So look, primary schools do it really well in terms of high schools. bringing in elders or community members to do some language or artwork. But yeah, the argument now is embedding that stuff into curriculum and embedding things into having voice and recognition in constitution or in law, and having more representation in our government is kind of where the argument's going now. So that there's more Indigenous people in government, more in politics, and we're starting to look at our structures more, so in the curriculum, in our health system, and all of that. So that's where the kind of push is going now. Yeah.
Beautiful. I guess on that note, as we're starting to look forward to the things that we can continue to do as a community, and holding the privilege that we do, how we can leverage that to create change, we might kind of wrap it up there for the night, with the promise that we'll continue this chat for the next month. There are movies coming up. Obviously, some of you guys were at the In My Blood It Runs screening that we had a couple of weeks ago. We had 100 people come along to that. As I mentioned, Looky Looky, Here Comes Cookie is coming out. Maybe we can do a bit of a community screening of that. And just let's keep chatting, because like Chris is saying, we've got to keep ourselves informed and engaged and energised and aware of what we can do to leverage this fortunate position that we're in the landscape that we live in, to help support and be more effective allies for the people who can use it.
Can I plug one more thing?
Plug away.
Sorry, I did have a short little teaser film to show. I don't know if it's still up. Is that all right? 2 minutes, I think.
Right.
Sorry.
Nice.
So I'm working on a film project with Larissa Brent, who's a first Indigenous woman to get a PhD at Harvard. And has anyone seen Maralinga? It was recently out, Maralinga. So that's on the nuclear testing.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So that was on ABC, I think. But you can have a look at that. So she's done a lot of films, and she works at University of Technology Sydney. But we're working on a film called The First Inventors, or series, sorry, with 4 episodes. So I don't know. I was going to show you the teaser for it.
Yeah, do it.
Because that's the exciting stuff I like working on.
Yeah, that's right.
You might need to drive this one, Chris. One where the actual file is.
Oh.
Or just mime it out.
Oh, okay. I think this, will it work? I'm not too sure. Oh, there's the link. Oh shit, what do I do?
Guys, as Chris is getting that organised, just a huge and heartfelt thanks for coming along, for showing up and putting ourselves in a place where we can acknowledge that we don't know heaps of stuff, right? That's okay. The boldness of sitting in, the discomfort of our ignorance is that important thing. We have to hold a bit of guilt and hold a bit of shame, and then with that, be open to learning and changing and growing and having conversations with other people, and continuing to change our mindset as we learn more and do better. So thank you everyone for showing up. We'll hopefully get this up and running, but then we'll kind of call it there. So just wanted to offer you huge thanks for coming along, and stay in touch. We'll flick out an email after this with some extra resources. We'll put the slideshow, put some links to some things, and then the action board will appear in a week or two, and we'll just get involved in that. You can do a little, you can do a lot, you can do stuff and not put it up there. That doesn't really matter. It's just an invitation to everybody to keep this stuff going, because things don't have to be as they are. We can do a little bit better. So thanks everyone.
Now the sound might be poor quality, sorry. So just stick with me.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. What does it say?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's their whole household.
Yeah.
Jamie, Hannah, Tanny.
Hi guys.
It's the fourth studio.
Yeah.
Something you could email them?
Yeah.
Possibly, yeah. 'Cause it's not coming up, is it?
No, I'm probably having a hard time finding stuff.
Okay.
We can flick the link around. Is it
Okay, sure.
publicly accessible?
Yeah, I might have to flick it around. So sorry about that, everyone. But
It's
didn't
the
work.
ultimate teaser. Like, you don't even get to see.
Oh, yeah.
That's
Isn't
right.
it? Yeah.
Creative mastermind.
Yeah. Cool.
Beautiful thugs. Chris,
No
thank you so
worries.
much for coming along. We'll be doing this on the regular. Next month we have the Environment Minister and a former Greens representative coming in. We're going to have a bit of a Enviro panel. We'll open the floor for questions. We'll get them submitted ahead of time. So let's find out more, put people on the spot. Let's find out how we can more effectively advocate in that space as well. That'll be for next month. Yeah, keep posted. Stay engaged. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
That's okay.
A question actually.
Yep.
My friend was just telling me, 'cause he goes to Flinders as well, and
Yeah.
they've said that they've created this new program where they're actively offering an Indigenous course for everyone in the uni, and they're making that available to everyone. So it's going to be part of your prerequisite.
Well, I think so. There's a major now,
Yeah.
a major Indigenous Studies, and then they're trying to get it into other degrees. Yeah, yeah. So that's not at the moment. Yeah, like an open elective. Yeah. So you can. I think they're now moving it into health. So health might pick up. Yeah, because it's quite a lot of students and a big demand for it. So yeah.
It's amazing. Imagine if we did have a prereq where, that's the way it should be, where you have to do this study in order to be able to go to uni. That is just amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's there's demand out there. Students want to do it. Yeah.
Who are studying that we can take to make an influence on our curriculum or our subjects that are available to us that you know of.
Are there?
Yeah.
Who do we email?
Oh.
Who's told me?
I can make
Are you at Flinders?
No, I'm at.
At Adelaide?
So Jamie and Sam partner, Hannah lives there, and Connie lives with her partner. So that's the big house.
It's yours.
Okay, cool. So I hope I see that. Yes. All right, let's do it. Okay.
It's such a conflict for me, but I feel like, well, not for me, but I see it as, well, sort of for me, yeah, but I don't really know. So I've heard a few people talking about it, feeling wrong about it. And I just, I mean, as a non-Indigenous person, I don't it's not my place to, really,
well, so the issue.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that the momentum that was really doing up.
Is both mind issues are aligned with the government.
I agree.
And so and often what they'll do is they'll fund, they provide a lot of funding for archaeologists as well. Record sites and they have to try that. I hope there's a bit of like spark and a bit of way. So, you know, like I want to see, not like a training room, not like kind of thing, but just to try to get like, and you know, they also fund Australian Archaeological Association. So we're going to progress now, putting in a submission as well to say we don't support this, but also in relation to funding, we're not going to just 100 people funding is risk as well. A lot of that money from one company goes it's a double sourcing.
oh, yeah, totally. And I've got that now push their own, they try with kids in their own kind of stuff.
And at the end of the day, finding interest in what we're
it's a disconnect.
And we don't want to
it's
be
upsetting, you know. No, you're going to get the credit for this reconciliation effort whilst she's destroying things, you know.
And the timing of those things is, I think, really slap people in the face. People like just
free to bloom, right?
you know, you can't.
You know, across them that they don't want to declare their court
say,
you know what I mean? Like
that's why
someone
it's
like,
actually
but there's no relationship between the timing.
Opposing sides in a way that they'll know they can't completely go one way because it's kind of slightly moderated by the other. Stop that, like, you know, the full picture or there's another way.
The approval for these things,
but also if you've got
other work was done and research now, but there's already approval given to the way this is the interest of the government, you know, approves those applications for the mining companies to do that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's where
And that's a line to land ownership as well, like,
this is the thing about the legal system and how it's not actually, it's not going to disrupt
or
power that
you know, Bailey
or
the wine industry. So
not even like
trying to bring that all together and navigate that through COVID.
Constitutional change and recognition of voice and all that, even that's not really going to disrupt
which I found was really interesting. I don't know
society around
how you know that might be in this
environment. And so you can see, like, I think
it's more of an industry update.
for us, I guess we're interested in like topics that are kind of that people feel passionate about. But feel like there are ways that you create action or to kind of dive in and get things. So
Because he was more talking
about republic,
different
so one of the,
things
that kind of fell from the agenda, but the republic is a way that you can change that.
Yeah, that discussion around how the
today,
so it was more or less the ripple effect.
Yes, and rewrite those context, because the issues right with the constitution and how we're still attached.
It was relevant purely to
so all that legal stuff, which is
and I don't have
kind of out there in my field, but we still
where the actual distribution of all our trade.
You know,
I just know the wine industry because that's my love. But you know all the other areas, I was like, oh shit, it's actually quite a lot.
Rather than a push for constitution change, you've still got laws which you would have to change.
China and how they set up so. Which he agreed with, but not the approach.
I still have things about much more for people. It's just, it's going to get enacted.
No, but like, but it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting shift because achieving potentially a similar result, you know, far more.
So it's really like
palatable. You know, like people enrolling in the idea of republic feels like a soft, soft to target. Like, you know, people like from across all spectrums. Doing that, you can like discard a lot of like the historical Commonwealth documents that are.
Exactly.
Stuff comes up and be good.
It's so possible.
I guess my main question is it
cool.
Is there a space for being able to?
Thank you so much.
That's okay.
No worries.
Thank you.
Are we able to contact you by?
Yeah, I think Dan's got my contact details. So